The sun sat low in the sky, spilling gold across the wide open land. It was the kind of morning when the wind felt warm and soft, carrying the smell of dry grass and earth. Thomas McGraw rode slowly, his old brown boots resting in the stirrups, his hat tilted just enough to keep the sunlight out of his eyes. He was a cowboy, a quiet one with a rough beard and calm hands. He had spent months traveling from one ranch to another, working wherever someone needed a strong back and a good heart. Every time he got paid, he saved a small piece of it. He didn't waste his money on cards or whiskey like many other cowboys did. Thomas had only one dream: to buy a good horse of his own. Not just any horse, but one strong enough to ride through open country, one fast enough to keep up with the wind. For weeks he had heard people talking about a native settlement a few miles north of the river. People said the tribe had some of the best horses in the land. They were known for raising horses that could run long distances without tiring, horses that were loyal and smart. Some cowboys said their horses were worth more than gold. Thomas had only 10 silver dollars, but he believed if he spoke honestly and showed respect, he might be able to make a fair trade. The road was long, and the sound of the horses' hooves echoed against the dry ground. He had borrowed a tired old mare from a ranch owner, promising to return her in a few days. As he rode, Thomas thought about the kind of horse he wanted, one with a shiny coat, tall legs, and steady eyes. He imagined himself riding across the plains, not having to borrow anyone's animal again. A horse of his own meant freedom. It meant he could choose where to go, how far to travel, and when to stop. By noon, the land around him began to change. He saw smoke rising gently in the distance. The wind carried the faint sound of drums, steady and soft like a heartbeat. Soon Thomas saw the teepees standing in neat circles, their white and brown cloth shining against the blue sky. Children ran between them laughing, their voices clear and bright. Men were fixing wooden frames and women were weaving colorful fabrics. The camp was alive with movement like a well-practiced song. Thomas slowed his horse and stopped just outside the settlement. He took off his hat out of respect and waited quietly. He knew enough to understand that walking straight in without invitation would be rude. After a few minutes, a tall man with black hair tied back in braids approached him. His eyes were calm but strong. He wore a necklace made of beads and feathers that moved gently in the wind. Thomas raised his hand slowly in greeting, and the man did the same. The man spoke in a language Thomas didn't fully understand, but his voice was not unfriendly. Thomas smiled and spoke slowly. "I came to trade. Horse. I have $10. He carefully pulled out the small leather pouch from his coat and showed the silver coins shining in his palm. The man tilted his head thoughtfully, then nodded and gestured for Thomas to follow. They walked through the camp, past the fire circles and the teepees. Thomas noticed how everyone seemed to work together. There was no rush or shouting, just quiet strength and order. It made him feel a little out of place, but also welcome in a way he couldn't explain. They reached a larger teepee in the center, and the tall man spoke a few words to someone inside. A few moments later, an older man stepped out. He had deep lines on his face like rivers carved into the land. His eyes were wise and steady. He wore a robe made of soft leather and carried a wooden stick decorated with feathers. Thomas understood right away. This was the chief. The chief stood tall, and though he didn't speak Thomas's language, there was no doubt he carried authority. Thomas held his hat respectfully against his chest. "Sir," he said quietly, "I wish to buy a horse. $10. Honest deal." The chief listened carefully as the translator, the tall man who had welcomed Thomas, explained in the tribe's language. The chief nodded slowly, then looked at Thomas. For a moment there was silence. The wind rustled the tall grass, and a few children nearby stopped their play to watch the stranger. The chief stepped forward and extended his hand. Thomas, knowing the meaning of such a gesture, shook it firmly. A handshake was simple, but in those times it was a promise. To Thomas it meant they had agreed on a fair trade, money for a horse. He felt a quiet relief in his chest. For months he had worked hard for this moment. Soon, he thought, he would finally own a horse of his own. The chief said something in his language, and a few people around nodded and smiled. Thomas didn't fully understand, but their faces looked warm, even happy. A young boy brought a pot of water, and the chief offered it to Thomas as a sign of friendship. Thomas drank slowly, feeling the coolness ease the dust in his throat. As the sun began to lower, Thomas was invited to sit by the main fire. A group of men sat around it, speaking softly in their language, their faces glowing orange from the flames. A woman brought him a bowl of warm stew made from beans and corn. Thomas thanked her with a small nod and ate slowly, grateful for the kindness. He noticed how the people around the fire laughed softly together, telling stories, their voices rising and falling like music. The chief sat a little apart, his expression calm but watchful. Thomas respected him deeply, even though they came from different worlds. After dinner, Thomas lay down near his saddle with the stars above him. He felt a light breeze on his face and watched the fire turn to glowing embers. In his mind, he pictured the horse he would ride at sunrise, maybe a strong chestnut mare or a tall black stallion. He imagined the moment he'd hand over the $10 and take the reins in his hand. He smiled to himself, feeling a warm excitement, but beneath that excitement there was something else too. A quiet uncertainty he couldn't quite name. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you are in a place where everything works differently than what you're used to. He didn't speak their language, didn't know their customs, but he trusted the handshake. That to him was enough. As the night deepened, the camp slowly grew quiet. Only the sound of the wind and the soft crackle of the fire remained. Thomas pulled his blanket tighter and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he thought, everything will change. He would no longer be a man who borrows. He would be a man with his own horse, a cowboy with real freedom. What he didn't know was that the handshake he thought was a simple trade meant something very different to the chief and his people. In their eyes, that handshake was not about buying a horse. It was about forming a bond. But Thomas couldn't see that yet. All he knew was the soft feel of the earth beneath him, the quiet stars above, and the dream of a new beginning just hours away. Morning came softly to the camp. The sky was painted with gentle pink and orange colors, and a cool breeze moved through the tall grass like a quiet song. Birds were the first to wake up, singing from the nearby trees. A few horses could be seen in the distance, their heads bent down as they calmly ate the grass. Thomas opened his eyes slowly, feeling the warmth of the first sunlight touch his face. For a few seconds he forgot where he was. Then the memory returned. The handshake with the chief, the fire, the promise of a horse. He sat up, brushed the dust off his shirt, and stretched his arms. It was a good morning, the kind that made a man feel alive. He looked around and saw people already moving about. Women were cooking by the fire, stirring pots that sent up small clouds of steam. Children ran here and there, laughing, their small feet kicking up dust. Men were walking toward the edge of the camp where the horses were tied. Everything seemed peaceful, like the day had begun with a smile. Thomas stood and placed his hat on his head. His heart was light. Today was the day he would finally have a horse of his own. He imagined the strong legs of the horse, the smooth coat shining in the sun, and the feeling of the wind on his face as he rode away. He had worked so hard for this. He had waited so long. He walked slowly toward the center of the camp near the fire circle. The chief was already there, standing tall with a serious but kind expression. His robe moved gently with the wind, and his necklace of feathers and beads made a soft sound when he turned. The same tall man who had spoken to Thomas yesterday stood beside him. He smiled at Thomas and gestured for him to come closer. Thomas felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He didn't know exactly how things worked here. He hoped he had done everything right. He had trusted the handshake, the most honest promise he knew. As Thomas approached, a group of women and girls stood not too far away, their long, dark hair shining in the morning light. Among them were two young women wearing special clothing. Their dresses were made of soft, decorated fabric. They wore colorful necklaces, and their hair was neatly braided with small beads woven into it. They looked graceful, standing quietly, their eyes lowered. Thomas noticed how everyone in the camp seemed to be watching him. Their faces were calm, but there was a feeling in the air that he didn't fully understand. The chief said a few words in his language, and the tall man translated, "The chief welcomes you this morning."
He is glad for your promise.
"Today's a good day." Thomas smiled and nodded. "Yes, good day." "Horse," he said, pointing toward the fields where the horses were kept. He held his hand out as if holding invisible reins to make it clear what he meant. The translator listened, but instead of nodding quickly, he gave a slow look toward the chief. The chief spoke again, this time a little longer. His voice was deep and calm, and the people around them listened carefully. The translator turned to Thomas and said slowly, "The chief has accepted your offering. His heart is open to you. You gave him silver. He gave you a bond." Thomas blinked, not fully understanding. "A bond?" he repeated, confused. He had expected the translator to say something about a horse, maybe telling him to pick one or wait for someone to bring it. The translator's words came carefully, as if each one mattered. "The chief gives you something more than a horse. He gives you family." Thomas's smile faded slightly. He looked at the chief, then at the two young women standing quietly nearby. His heart gave a small, uncertain beat. "No. Horse?" he said gently, pointing again toward the fields. The chief nodded with pride and gestured toward the two women. Then he spoke firmly, as though announcing something important. The translator explained, "The chief gives you his two daughters. They will walk with you. They are now your family." The sound of his words hung in the air like a bell. For a moment everything felt quiet except for the soft wind moving through the camp. Thomas stared, trying to understand what had just been said. He looked at the daughters. They stood gracefully, their eyes calm and full of expectation. Around them, the people of the tribe watched with quiet approval. To them, this was a beautiful and honorable thing. But to Thomas, it was completely unexpected. His 10 silver dollars were meant for a horse. Nothing more. He had never thought about anything else. He felt the ground beneath his boots, steady and real, but his thoughts spun like leaves in a storm. He wanted to speak, to explain, but the right words didn't come. His language was not their language. His world was not their world. The chief stepped closer. He placed his hand over his heart, then extended it toward Thomas. His eyes were filled with meaning, as if he was giving a great gift. Thomas could feel how serious this moment was. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a small matter. In their eyes, this was a bond between families, something far greater than a trade. The two daughters walked slowly toward Thomas, their heads slightly bowed in respect. Their steps were quiet, soft as grass. When they reached him, they stood still, waiting. It was clear that in their culture, the chief's promise was final. Thomas opened his mouth, trying to find simple words. I pay for horse." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't want to sound disrespectful. He didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. The chief's eyes were kind but firm. He didn't seem to doubt what he believed the deal was. The translator looked at Thomas and said gently, "In this place, silver is not for animals. Silver is for family. You gave a great gift." So the chief gave a great gift back. Thomas felt his heart beat faster. He understood now what had happened. His handshake, the thing he thought meant trade, meant something completely different here. He had offered what the tribe saw as a marriage gift. The chief, seeing the silver, had decided Thomas was a man of honor and worth, and so he gave him something that to them was far more valuable than a horse. Thomas took a small step back, trying to stay calm. He didn't want to seem ungrateful. The chief stood proudly, waiting for him to accept. The two young women lowered their eyes, respectful and patient. Around the fire, soft murmurs passed through the people. Some smiled, some whispered quietly to each other. They thought the cowboy must be happy. To them, it was a wonderful beginning. Thomas knew he had to say something soon, but he felt like he was walking on a thin rope. One wrong word could turn respect into insult, and he didn't want that. He breathed deeply. The smell of the morning fire filled the air, mixing with the sweet scent of flowers tied into the daughter's hair. He thought about turning and leaving, but that would be rude. He thought about taking the silver back, but the handshake was already made. He thought about trying to explain everything in English, but they wouldn't understand all of it. The chief spoke again. His voice was calm and steady, and the translator said softly, "The daughters are ready. Their hearts are open. The tribe is happy. Today is a strong day." Thomas forced a small smile. He didn't want to show confusion or worry. He could feel how serious and sacred this was to them. It was no simple misunderstanding. This was a difference between two worlds. The sun climbed higher and the light shone on the chief's face. The two daughters stood beside Thomas like two pieces of the tribe's heart. The people around them nodded with quiet approval. To them, the bond was already made. But inside Thomas, a storm of questions spun like wind through the plains. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't asked for this. Yet here it was, a moment that would change everything. As the morning stretched on, the camp felt both warm and heavy. The fire burned gently, Horses neighed softly in the distance, and the wind carried the sound of drums starting to play again. The tribe celebrated the new bond, but Thomas stood still, caught between the life he knew and the world he had stepped into without fully understanding it. Thomas stood under the warm morning sun, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The camp was slowly filling with cheerful sounds. Women were singing softly while preparing food. Children were running and laughing, and some men were getting ready for what seemed like a special ceremony. The people were happy, their faces bright and full of life. But inside Thomas, everything felt mixed up and unsure. The chief stood proudly near the fire, his robe moving gently in the breeze. The two young women, his daughters, stood quietly beside Thomas. They didn't look frightened or confused. In fact, their calm faces showed that they understood what was happening far better than he did. To them, this day was important. This was not just a trade. It was something far deeper. But Thomas hadn't come here for this. He had only wanted to buy a horse. He took a small step back and lifted his hand gently, trying to explain. "Chief, I came for horse. Just horse. No family," he said softly. His voice wasn't angry or rude. It was quiet, like someone trying to explain something carefully. The tall man who had spoken for the chief the day before listened and then translated Thomas's words. When the chief heard the translation, his face remained calm, but his eyes showed surprise. He spoke slowly and firmly, as if he thought Thomas was only joking. The translator then turned to Thomas and said, "The chief says, the daughters are ready. The bond is made. It is a good day." Thomas's heart beat a little faster. He shook his head slowly. "No, not what I mean," he whispered. He pointed toward the horses in the distance. "Horse, $10. I thought we made deal. Horse." The translator tried his best to make sense of what Thomas was saying. It wasn't easy because the tribe's way of seeing this moment was very different. When Thomas had offered his $10 the chief had seen it as something honorable, not a trade like in the cowboys' world. To them, a man who offered something of value wasn't just buying an animal. He was offering his heart and trust. And to return that trust, the chief had offered what was most precious, his daughters. The chief spoke again, longer this time. His voice was strong but still calm. The translator turned to Thomas and said, "The chief says in this place horses are not given for silver. Horses are for people of the tribe. But family is given to men who bring silver with respect. You gave silver, so he gave family." Thomas looked around. The people were still watching quietly. Their faces showed kindness, not anger. To them, this moment was special. A few women smiled gently at the daughters as if proud of them. A group of young men nodded respectfully at Thomas. They didn't see confusion on his face. They saw a man who was now part of their world. For a long moment, Thomas didn't know what to say or do. He felt a weight pressing down on his chest. It wasn't a heavy or cruel weight, just something big and serious. His $10 had meant one thing to him, but something completely different to them. He looked at the daughters again. They stood with grace and calmness, their braided hair shining softly in the light, their hands folded gently in front of them. They were ready to follow the promise their father had made. The chief took a slow step forward. He placed his hand on his own heart and then gently on Thomas's chest. It was a gesture of connection, not force. It said, "You are now part of us." Thomas could feel the respect in that touch. The chief then raised his hands toward the sky, and the people around began to hum softly. The sound was warm and low, like a song carried by the wind. Thomas knew he couldn't just walk away. That would be rude and disrespectful. These people had trusted him. They had believed his silver and his handshake were a promise. If he walked away now, it wouldn't just be a broken trade. It would be breaking something sacred. But he also couldn't simply accept something he didn't mean to agree to. The translator came closer to Thomas and spoke gently. "The chief believes your heart is open. He gave you his daughters because you gave him trust. If you do not accept, it will make him feel sad. But you are free to speak." Thomas looked into the chief's kind but serious eyes. He didn't see anger there. He saw pride, respect, and hope. The daughters stood silently, waiting for whatever was to come. No one pushed him or forced him. The air was still soft, even though the moment felt heavy. He took a deep breath. "I respect your people," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "I respect, Chief, but I am not here to make family. I came only for horse. That is all." The translator's voice carried his words into the air. The chief listened, his expression thoughtful. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The wind moved through the camp softly, brushing against the tents and the fire. Then the chief spoke again, his words calm but firm. The translator said, "The chief says a man's word is his bond. A handshake is a promise. In this place, when two hands meet, the sky watches and remembers." Thomas understood the meaning, even if the words were simple. A handshake was not just a friendly greeting here. It was a promise, almost like writing your name on paper in his world. He had shaken hands with the chief, smiling, without knowing what that handshake truly meant to them. Now he was standing in the middle of their belief and his mistake. One of the daughters lifted her eyes slowly and looked at him. She didn't speak, but her gaze was soft and full of understanding. She didn't seem angry or hurt. She simply stood there as if to say, "You are not a stranger now." Thomas's chest tightened with a quiet emotion he couldn't fully name. He wasn't used to being part of something this big, this meaningful. His life had always been about work, traveling, and surviving. No one had ever offered him something like this. Not a bond, not a family, not trust this deep. The chief gestured toward the fire and invited Thomas to sit. The people around slowly moved closer, forming a circle. The daughters sat too, their hands folded neatly on their laps. The tribe began to sing a slow, gentle song that rose into the air like a soft wave. The fire crackled in front of them, and Thomas felt the warmth against his skin. The translator whispered, "The chief is offering you to stay. If you accept, the tribe will celebrate. If you don't, he will listen. But he believes promises are important." Thomas stared into the fire. His thoughts spun quietly. He hadn't meant to make a promise. But maybe, in some way, he had. His silver had spoken louder than his words. His handshake had said more than he realized. Now the tribe believed he was part of their story. He thought about leaving. He imagined riding away with his 10 silver dollars still in his pocket. But the picture didn't feel right. It didn't feel respectful. He imagined trying to explain this story later to other cowboys around a campfire. They might laugh, but they wouldn't truly understand what this moment meant. These people had opened their hearts to him, believing he had done the same. He didn't know what the right choice was. But he did know one thing: he had to speak carefully. Not just for himself, but for them too. He lifted his head and looked at the chief. "I respect your people," he said softly. "I did not know what the handshake meant. Where I come from, it means trade. Here, it means family. I understand now." The translator carried the words. The chief nodded slowly, understanding the truth behind them. He wasn't angry. In his eyes, Thomas could see that the chief was a man who valued honesty. The chief spoke again, this time in a shorter sentence. The translator said, "He says, if your heart is not ready, you must speak. The sky will understand." Thomas felt his chest relax just a little. They weren't going to force him. They had respected him from the beginning, and they would respect him now too. But he also understood that his mistake had meaning. It wasn't something small. This moment would stay with them all. The tribe continued their soft song, the daughters sat patiently, and the chief waited quietly. Thomas sat in the middle, a cowboy far from home, learning a lesson no one had ever taught him before. A handshake could mean many things. A few silver coins could carry more weight than he ever imagined. And trust was something too deep to take lightly. The fire burned brighter as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Thomas's heart felt both heavy and full at the same time. He knew the moment he spoke next would shape everything that came after. The fire in the center of the camp glowed softly as the morning moved closer to noon. The song of the tribe had slowly faded into the wind, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt both peaceful and serious. Thomas sat near the fire with his hat resting in his hands. The chief stood across from him, his calm eyes watching every small movement. The two young women, his daughters, sat nearby, their hands folded gently in their laps. Around them, the tribe waited silently, as if they all knew this was an important moment. Thomas had never felt a silence this heavy. It wasn't the kind of silence that made a man feel alone. It was the kind that made every heartbeat seem louder. His mind was full of thoughts, each one spinning like dust in the wind. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. But he felt the weight of the situation resting quietly on his shoulders. This wasn't just a trade gone wrong. This was a moment where two very different worlds had crossed, and he stood right in the middle of it. The chief took a step forward. His face was calm, his movement steady. He spoke in his own language, his voice deep and smooth like the sound of a river moving through stones. The translator, the tall man with kind eyes, turned to Thomas and said, "The chief says the wind brought you here for a reason. He believes no man meets another without meaning." Thomas listened carefully. Those words touched something deep inside him. He had spent most of his life moving from place to place with no real plan. He had followed open roads, worked for strangers, slept under stars. He had always thought his journey was just about finding work and earning enough to get by. But now, sitting in this circle, listening to a man who believed in meaning, he began to wonder if perhaps this moment had a purpose. The chief continued to speak, and the translator said, "He says his daughters are precious. They are strong, kind, and loyal. To give them is to give a part of his heart. He does this because he believes you are a good man." Thomas looked at the two daughters. Their faces were soft and calm, their eyes kind but serious. They didn't look afraid or uncertain. They looked ready, as if they had grown up knowing that one day their father would make such a promise. It made Thomas feel something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pressure. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet understanding that this meant everything to them. He gently placed his hat on the ground beside him and lifted his eyes to the chief. "I didn't know," he said softly. "Where I come from, when we shake hands, it means a trade, not this." The translator shared his words with the chief. The chief nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. He wasn't angry. His eyes showed respect. Then he spoke again. The translator's voice was gentle. "The chief says he understands your heart is from another place. He knows your people live differently, but he also says words and promises have power, no matter where they are spoken." The tribe around them nodded slightly. To them, a promise was a promise. It didn't matter if the other man came from a faraway land. What mattered was that two hands had met and the fire had seen it. Thomas lowered his eyes for a moment. He thought of all the handshakes he had made in his life, quick deals at ranches, small promises to strangers, but never had one felt like this. Never had a handshake felt like it held the weight of someone's heart. The translator moved closer and said softly, "If you leave now, the chief will not stop you, but the people will feel sadness. Not anger, but sadness. They believe you were sent here for a reason." Thomas's chest tightened a little. The idea of walking away suddenly didn't feel as easy as he thought. He could leave, ride back to the ranch, and continue his life the way it was. But something deep inside told him he would carry this story forever, not as a simple memory, but as something that would always stay with him. The chief then turned and spoke to his daughters. His voice was low but full of meaning. The daughters nodded softly and then slowly stood up. They walked to where Thomas sat, stopping a few steps away from him. One of them held a small woven cloth in her hands. It was decorated with beads that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. She stepped forward and placed it carefully on the ground in front of Thomas. The translator said, "This is a gift of respect. It means they accept your heart, whatever your answer may be." Thomas stared at the cloth. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was trust. It was their way of saying, "We are not against you." He felt something stir inside him. He wasn't used to being trusted like this. In his travels, people shook hands because they had to. But here, people shook hands because they believed in something more. The second daughter raised her eyes to look at him for a brief moment. She didn't speak, but her gentle gaze said 1,000 things. She wasn't demanding anything from him. She wasn't asking for promises. She was simply standing there with quiet strength. Thomas slowly picked up the woven cloth. It felt soft in his hands, almost like holding a memory that wasn't even his yet. He pressed it gently against his chest, not because anyone told him to, but because it felt right. The chief took a few steps closer and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. It was a simple touch, but it carried warmth. The translator said, "The chief says your path is your choice. If your heart says to stay, the tribe will celebrate. If your heart says to go, they will still honor the bond as a lesson." Thomas felt his throat tighten slightly. This wasn't the kind of situation where someone won or lost. It was a moment where hearts spoke louder than words. He didn't feel forced. He felt seen, in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. He took a slow breath. "I came for a horse one," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "But maybe I was meant to learn something else." The translator's eyes softened as he shared those words with the chief. The chief smiled gently, just a small curve of the lips, but it carried the warmth of the sun. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of a man who had been understood. The tribe began to hum again, their voices rising softly like wind through leaves. The chief's daughters moved back a little, giving Thomas space. No one rushed him. No one pushed. They were giving him time to decide, and in that silence he felt their respect even more deeply. Thomas thought of the road outside the camp, the one that stretched endlessly, the one he had followed for years. He thought of long nights alone, quiet mornings, borrowed horses, and empty pockets. Then he thought of this moment. A fire, a tribe, warm eyes that looked at him not like a stranger but like someone who mattered. The chief spoke again. The translator said softly, "He says family is not always by blood. Sometimes family is chosen. Sometimes it finds you." Those words wrapped around Thomas like a warm blanket. He wasn't sure if he belonged here. He wasn't sure if he was ready to accept what they were offering. But he knew one thing. This moment had changed something inside him. The wind moved through the camp again, lifting a few strands of the daughter's braided hair. The sound of the fire cracked softly, steady and calm. The tribe waited quietly, trusting his heart to speak. Thomas looked at the chief, then at the daughters, and finally down at the cloth in his hands. He felt the weight of the moment, but it was not a heavy weight. It was the kind that makes a man stand taller, think clearer, and feel more alive. He finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I came for a horse, but I found something I didn't expect. I found respect. I found trust. I don't know what happens next, but I will not forget this. Ever." The translator carried his words carefully. The chief nodded. The tribe's faces softened with understanding. One of the daughters gave a small, graceful bow. Not because she was giving up, but because she respected his heart. The chief lifted his hand toward the sky, and then brought it down slowly. The tribe followed his movement. It was a sign of peace, a sign that whatever Thomas decided, the bond of respect would stay. The humming turned into a soft song again, and Thomas felt a quiet warmth filling his chest. He didn't have a horse yet, but he had something far more unexpected, a story that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The chief walked toward him and gently pressed the silver coins back into his hand. The translator said softly, "He gives this back. The promise has been honored. The lesson remains." Thomas closed his hand around the coins. The wind felt different now, like it was carrying part of this place with it. He looked around the camp, at the fire, the people, the faces that now felt less like strangers. Something in him had changed forever. The tribe slowly began to move again, returning to their daily life. Children laughed. Women cooked. Men prepared the horses. But Thomas stayed seated for a while longer, holding the cloth in his hands, listening to the soft sounds of the world around him. The misunderstanding that had started as a simple handshake had become something bigger than trade. It had become a lesson, a gentle one wrapped in respect, kindness, and the quiet power of human connection. The sky was turning a soft gold as the sun began to lower behind the wide, open plains. The wind had grown calm, moving gently through the tall grass around the camp. The sounds of the day were quieting. The laughter of children had softened, and the rhythmic sounds of work had faded into the distance. Smoke from the campfire rose in thin lines, curling slowly into the cool air. Thomas sat near the edge of the camp on a smooth piece of wood, holding the woven cloth in his hands. Its small beads caught the fading sunlight and reflected tiny points of color. The 10 silver coins the chief had returned lay safely in his pocket, but they no longer felt like the most important thing he carried. When he had arrived here, those coins were everything to him. They were the dream of a horse, a symbol of independence and freedom. Now, after everything that had happened, they felt light, almost unimportant compared to what he had learned. He looked around the camp. People were sitting near the fire, sharing food, stories, and laughter. The chief sat with a few elders, their faces calm and wise. The 2 young women, the chief's daughters, were with the other women helping prepare the evening meal. Every once in a while, one of them looked in his direction, not with anger, not with sadness, but with quiet understanding. Their faces carried a kind of grace that made Thomas feel both humbled and grateful. He thought about how different his life had been until now. He had spent so many years moving from place to place, never staying long enough for anything to grow. He had worked hard, earned money, spent it, and moved on. He had never really felt like he belonged anywhere. But here, even as a stranger, he had been treated with respect. They had trusted him. They had believed in his word more than many people he had worked with before. He thought of the chief's steady eyes and his calm voice. He thought of the way the tribe had waited silently for him to speak, not forcing him, not judging him, simply trusting that he would choose from his heart. That kind of respect was something rare in his world. It was something he would not forget. As the sky turned from gold to soft pink, the chief rose from his place and walked slowly toward Thomas. His steps were quiet, his robe moving gently with the breeze. When he reached Thomas, he sat down beside him without saying a word at first. The fire crackled softly in the distance, and the stars were just beginning to show above them. The chief finally spoke in his own language. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was warm, calm, and full of meaning. A few moments later, the tall man who had always helped with translation came and sat beside them. "The chief says," the translator began, "he is thankful that you came with a good heart. He says sometimes people meet for a reason they don't understand at first. He believes this was one of those times." Thomas listened quietly, his eyes on the fire. "Tell him, I am thankful too," he said softly. The translator shared the words. The chief nodded, his kind eyes shining faintly in the firelight. He spoke again, and the translator said, "He says when two paths cross, they both change. Even if they walk apart after, they are never the same again." Those words settled deep in Thomas's chest. He knew they were true. Even if he rode away from this place tomorrow, a part of this moment would always stay with him. The chief then gestured toward the two daughters. They were now sitting with a group of women, their soft laughter mixing with the night breeze. They looked happy, not broken or bitter. The translator explained, "The chief says his daughters understand. They are proud their father offered something special, and they respect the way you spoke with truth." Thomas looked at them one more time. He felt a warm sense of peace in his chest. He hadn't taken what was offered, but he had treated it with care, and that to these people mattered. The chief then handed Thomas a long piece of leather string with a small carved wooden token tied to it. The carving was simple but beautiful, a symbol shaped like a sun over a river. "He gives you this," the translator said. "It means you are welcome here. It means when the wind brings you back, this place will remember your name." Thomas took the token in his hands and closed his fingers around it. The wood felt warm, as if it had its own quiet heartbeat. He looked at the chief and nodded slowly. "Tell him, I will carry this always," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. The translator shared the message. The chief's smile was small but full of warmth. He placed a hand over his own heart, then gently over Thomas's chest. It was the same gesture as before, but this time it felt different. It felt like a farewell built not on sadness but on respect. As the night deepened, the tribe began their evening songs. The drums were slow and gentle, their rhythm like the heartbeat of the land itself. The stars shone brighter now, stretching endlessly across the dark sky. Thomas sat beside the fire, listening to the sound that he knew he would never forget. He thought about the road that waited for him beyond the camp. He could almost see it in his mind. The dusty trail, the open fields, the quiet nights under the stars. He had always traveled it alone, but now it felt different. He would not be leaving empty. He would carry the woven cloth, the wooden token, and the memory of this place. For the first time in a long while, he felt connected to something bigger than himself. Not because he owned anything here, not because he made a deal, but because he had shared something real with people who had opened their hearts to him. The chief's daughters joined the song, their soft voices rising with the others. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel the fire's warmth on his face and the cool wind brushing against his skin. It felt like the world itself was speaking, not with words, but with something quieter and stronger. He remembered how it all began. Just a cowboy with 10 silver dollars in his pocket, looking for a horse. He smiled softly to himself. What he had found was far more than a horse. He had found a lesson, a gentle reminder that every handshake can carry a story, every step can lead to something unexpected, and not all treasures can be held in your hand. Some stay in your heart. As the last of the song faded into the night, Thomas slowly rose to his feet. The chief stood as well. The tribe watched quietly, not with sadness, but with a calm knowing that parting was part of life. The chief placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder one last time, and Thomas returned the gesture. Placing his hand over his heart, the translator said softly, "He says the road will always welcome you back." Thomas nodded. "And I will never forget this place." He walked to the edge of the camp where the borrowed mare waited. The same horse that had brought him here would now carry him away. But this time he carried something with him too, a story, a lesson, and a bond. As he mounted the horse, the tribe didn't wave or shout. Instead, they stood quietly, their faces glowing softly in the firelight. It was their way of saying farewell with dignity. Thomas took one last look at the camp, the fire, the people, the chief, and his daughters. The stars above seemed to shine brighter here, as if blessing the moment. He gave a gentle pull on the reins, and the mare began to walk. The sound of the horse's hooves blended with the night wind. The camp grew smaller behind him, but the warmth of it stayed inside him, steady and strong. As the road stretched out before him, Thomas touched the wooden token that hung around his neck. He held it gently between his fingers and whispered to himself, "I came for a horse, but I found something far greater." The plains opened wide under the starlight. The wind whispered softly around him. And though he was riding alone for the first time in his life, Thomas didn't feel lonely. He carried with him a piece of a story that would last far beyond the road. And somewhere behind him, in the quiet camp under the stars, a chief and his people sat around the fire, remembering the cowboy who came with silver and left with something far more precious, a bond that could never be broken by distance or time.